Danielle. And if there are those who join us, log in later, we will admit them into the meeting. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Women's International Forum's October event. I think I know almost everyone and you know me, but I will still say that my name is Zarina Warukati and I'm president of WIF. On behalf of the WIF Executive Board, I welcome all of you and thank you all for your continued support of our programs. We're delighted to see so many of you today. I would also like to thank Ms. Danielle de la Fuente, founder and executive director of Amal Alliance, today's speaker. Thank you, Danielle, for accepting our invitation. Danielle is someone I consider to be a change maker. She's driven by her belief that she can make an impact on the future of displaced children. She founded Amal Alliance with the aim of providing a basic curriculum that allows refugee children access to academic learning as well as socio-emotional learning to help them cope with the invisible scars of trauma and guarantee future opportunities to succeed. The Amal Alliance is a non-profit, non-governmental organization dedicated to empowering displaced children through social development programs at refugee camps and informal settlements around the globe. The organization is based on the premise that we are all global citizens, sharing the social and moral responsibility to ensure all children have access to the learning fundamentals acquired during early childhood development, as well as the basic life skills and tools necessary to reach their full potential. In September 2020, just last month, Amal Alliance was selected by the UN Refugee Agency, known as the UNHCR, for its Humanitarian Education Accelerator COVID-19 Challenge. That's a mouthful. It's a response to learning emergency caused by COVID-19 school closures. Amal Alliance launched an Education in Emergencies prototype, building on the initial COVID-19 response to bridge the learning gap presented by the pandemic through audio, social, emotional learning for marginalized children with little to no tech. So today's topic, Reimagining Learning, providing a future for refugee children, is very pertinent and timely. According to the UN, there are nearly 30 million refugees, over half of whom are under the age of 18. There are also millions of stateless people who have been denied a nationality and access to basic rights such as education. Many of these children will spend their entire childhoods away from home, sometimes separated from their families. They may have witnessed or experienced violence acts and in exile are at risk of abuse, neglect, violence, exploitation, trafficking, or military recruitment. But children are incredibly resilient, as we know. By learning, playing, and exploring their skills, they can find ways to cope, drawing strength from their families and communities. Through psychosocial support activities and education, we can help these children rebuild their lives. Of the 19.9 million refugees under the care of the UNHCR, 7.4 million are of school age. Their access to education is limited, with 4 million unable to attend school. The gains in educational enrollment revealed in this year's UNHCR report on refugees and education, small as they are in percentage terms, still represent life-changing opportunities for tens of thousands of refugee children, adolescents, and youth. Refugee enrollment in primary school is up from 61 to 63%, while secondary level enrollment has risen from 23 to 24%. And there has been a rise in the numbers of refugees accessing higher education from 1 to 3%. So with this as background, let us hear from Danielle on what her NGO is doing to help refugee children. Danielle, you have the floor.
So much, Zarina, and I believe my slides will start shortly. So let me just wait to see if, thank you so much. In here, okay. Well, as Zarina mentioned, hello, I am Danielle de la Fuente, founder and executive director of Amal Alliance, and I am so honored to be with you here today and be able to share a bit about our work. So as we begin, I'd really like you to take a moment and imagine a little girl. She's about 1 year old, born in Iraq. Her mother was abducted by ISIS, and she was fortunate enough and she managed to escape. She was now pregnant again and in imminent danger, so she knew she needed to flee with her family. Her father paid smugglers to transport them inside barrels from Mosul all the way to Turkey. After being detained and smuggled again on a boat that nearly cost them their life, they made it to Greece. But that story isn't unique. With the continuous conflict, political strife, and numerous natural disasters, it's no surprise that a staggering 79.5 million have been forcibly displaced worldwide. Over 34 million are children who were not only uprooted from their homes, but many are unaccompanied minors who were also uprooted from their families. Next slide, please. What connects all of these stories are the children, especially that unaccompanied minor population that is essentially invisible, forgotten by displacement, and spends an average of 17 years displaced and living in a refugee camp or informal settlement. If these children have no access to services, they'll never be employable. They won't become productive members of society. They're just sitting ducks to all sorts of security risks, whether it be human trafficking, exploitation, child marriage, or being recruited by terrorist organizations. Not only have these children lived through horrors unimaginable to most, they find themselves in these environments that produce chronic and toxic stress. So without addressing the psychosocial remnants of trauma, the cycle of violence and poverty simply perpetuates. That's where we come in, providing holistic social development and educational programs. Next slide. We do so with 4 pillars of support: social emotional learning, psychosocial support, early childhood development, and peace building. Now, these pillars are the foundation of our award-winning Rainbow of Education program. Last December, we were deeply, deeply honored that the UN Agency of Refugees showcased our program at the inaugural Global Refugee Forum in Geneva as one of the most promising holistic practices. We wear that badge with honor. So imagine a rainbow where every color corresponds with a theme: red being emotions, blue being empathy, green being compassion. So as the child goes through the different colors of the rainbow, they develop their foundational social emotional competencies, basic life skills, and interpersonal and behavioral skills. It's a trauma-sensitive, child-centered approach that incorporates kids' yoga, play, mindfulness, dance, art therapy, creative writing, reading, and basically anything fun. So children learn how to balance and regulate their emotions, show and feel empathy for others, establish and maintain positive and trusting relationships, develop concentration, and learn those very valuable lessons on conflict resolution, especially learning how to breathe, to calm down when upset. So the original Rainbow is a 6-month program designed for children ages 7 to 12 in that primary age group. But we also have a mini Rainbow with a stronger focus on early childhood for the teeny ones. A key finding across the field has been that children having undergone toxic stress and living in these very hostile environments need additional support in overcoming learning barriers where traditional teaching methods fall short. The methodology meets children at their confidence and capability level and allows them to create their own learning strategies, helping regain a sense of normalcy and also closing that gap lost while out of school. Utilizing the arts helps us foster expression. It allows children to explore that trauma in a safe and nurturing environment so they can internalize it, process it, and in turn express it in a healthy manner. We encourage expression and teamwork throughout. This is so children can find their voice, agency, and that self-confidence they need to rebuild their lives. We want children to heal. So the idea of turning on their inner light and dissolving that darkness that surrounds them. To create a lasting impact, though, you must engage the local community. And our model uniquely builds on the strengths of the local NGOs, providing women of the refugee population as well as women of the host community with skills-based training to impart the curriculum. This provides newfound sense of purpose and livelihood for our teachers, and it's really based on collaboration. So we train, they teach, and together we transform lives. Even though we just turned 3, yep, we have already generated tremendous impact, having trained 74 teachers in 3 countries, Greece, Lebanon, and Turkey, and reached 1,100 children. Not too bad for a toddler, right? But moving beyond the numbers, we created a ripple effect with both the teachers and the students taking home what they learned and sharing it with their families, their siblings, and the community at large. But then COVID hit, presenting many disruptions to learning and adding significant stressors to optimal child development. As part of our original response, we spearheaded an emergency response consortium that included Qatar Foundation International, Salzburg Global Seminar, Karanga, and Learning in Times of Crisis. We knew that using our combined strengths and expertise, we could provide a timely response that addressed the needs of the most marginalized communities. Ultimately, we created We Are in This Together podcast, and it was meant to support the well-being of the caregivers and their children at the very onset of the pandemic. I'm talking about around April. It was provided in 4 languages, including Arabic, French, and Spanish, and distributed on 17 global platforms, whose networks comprise about 543 organizations and an estimated 160,000 combined users. So this idea of providing lessons through simple and practical bursts of audio instruction caught the attention of IDEO as well as UNHCR, who invited us to apply to the Humanitarian Education Accelerator COVID-19 Challenge. And yes, Serena, that is a handful, a mouthful. So this was a sub-window to a larger EdTech call put forth by UNHCR, the EdTech Hub, Education Alliance, Global Innovation Exchange, and Education Cannot Wait. It was a grueling competition. It even included a 1-week UN virtual boot camp. Believe it or not, that is a thing. And we actually made it, we were so happy to make it into the 3 finalists. So with their support, we are designing a prototype, and it's basically a second iteration of our podcast. And it's a hybrid model of our Rainbow Education program that is now turned into what we're calling Colors of Kindness. So we hope to re-engage learners and ease their transition back into the classroom and bridge that learning gap through innovative social emotional learning on a mobile app that works offline. Key point. So it launched in Bangladesh just 2 weeks ago, which was really exciting, with our implementing partner Friendship NGO in 4 schools, reaching both host community children as well as Rohingya refugees within the learning centers in the camp. This storybook is just an example of how we immerse the teacher into our vision of what this ideal experience could feel like and look like in a classroom. Each scenario guides them with our really cute little culturally sensitive and non-gendered creatures that we love. Next slide, please. So our solution includes 3 innovative components as featured from these screens. It's available on Android phones. It has the audio component, so the podcast itself, and then instructions on how to conduct the activities within our digital workbook. And all of that is complemented with visual aids to bring the audio to life. This is our English version, but the test run is being conducted in Bangla and Rohingya. We are certain that this model is going to prove scalable, and we hope to have it adapted and localized to many locations worldwide post-testing, which will end in December. So furthering the SDGs, our work supports and advances the 5 sustainable development goals listed here. And while COVID has presented numerous challenges, it is also a great opportunity to reimagine how learning can take place anywhere at any time. And it has put at the forefront the importance of well-being and cultivating social emotional competencies in our children. This global health crisis has further shown light on the fact that there is no such thing as good health if we do not address mental health as well. So 2 years ago, the G20 launched its initiative for early childhood development. The initiative affirmed the importance of early childhood as the foundation for future health and well-being, benefiting both individuals and societies. The working group that proposed this initiative expressed concerns that despite the evidence of high return rates, investment in early childhood development remained insufficient, and called for a closer examination of national investments, but mainly as a means of building human capital to break that cycle of intergenerational and structural poverty and of reducing inequalities, especially where young children are most vulnerable. Studies have shown that investing in social emotional learning yields an 11-to-1 ratio. And for every $1 invested in an early childhood intervention, you get a $17 return. So what is stopping us from investing in our youth? Now, before I conclude, I want you to think back to that little girl and the tens of millions of little girls and boys just like her that have been forgotten by displacement. Today I stand, or I Zoom before you, because I fervently believe that every child, no matter their circumstances, has the right to an education and to play as a child. I ask to please have you be our advocate for these countless children to ensure they reach their full potential, because you made sure they were no longer invisible. And thank you so much for your attention. I know we have a Q&A, but I wanted to show just a very brief clip of our work because pictures always speak more than words.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for that presentation, and congratulations for making the impact that you have made in such a short time since the creation of Amal Alliance. This is really an inspiring story. We now move on to the interactive part of today's event. And as the moderator, I will start with the Q&A. But those of you who would like to ask questions, please indicate your name in the chat box on the right-hand corner of the Zoom box, and then we will call you in order that your name appears. So once again, thank you, Danielle. Truly inspiring, and especially from such a young person that you are. I won't reveal how young you are, but it's really inspiration to all of us. As you mentioned in your presentation, and you said millions of children worldwide are displaced with limited to no access to an education, and the consequences of inaction are immeasurable and would be devastating for subsequent generations. What would you say is the single largest obstacle to making education accessible to refugees?
So that's a tough question, but let's see. So there's various different barriers that are all compounded together. But I think the largest obstacle is, in fact, that the institutional structures are missing a key piece. So for instance, typically basic needs are obviously the most prevalent, and education only gets 2% of humanitarian aid funding. 2%, that's very, very little. And then add to that, that you have, if children are lucky enough to be able to access education, well, they're traumatized. They're, oftentimes they don't speak the language of the host community. So one, you have a language barrier. Two, they're dealing with trauma. So even if they're in the classroom, they're really not ready to learn. So you need to address that trauma prior to engaging them into the system. So what ends up happening is you have all these dropouts that then put them back onto the streets and, directly onto this life of crime. And then that cycle just completely perpetuates. So I think the missing link is, if they do have access to a formal education system, which is fantastic, they need to have that step right before. So whether it is, additional aids and making sure that they can understand the language of instruction, or dealing with that psychosocial sort of the issues that are arising prior to expecting them to learn in an academic environment that is really only based on outcomes and output.
All right. Yeah. And as you said, the pandemic has made online education more widespread around the world. Has this made your task easier or more challenging?
Much more challenging. I can't wait for COVID to go away. No, so basically, the pandemic has really shown that a lot of our education systems are a bit outdated and are in time for a revamp. But also, it's grown really, really big light on the fact that there's massive digital inequalities.
Yes.
And so, many children don't have access to devices. And if they do have access to devices, well, they might not have connectivity. So, that in itself makes it more difficult. And I'll give you an example. So when we were first conducting our needs assessment to launch the prototype in Bangladesh, we were originally supposed to deliver the model via the parents. But our research indicated that typically you had maybe one device in a family of a household of 5 or 6. And that device, usually whoever was in charge was the adult male, which meant that, if you were a child, you may not have access to, an hour or so a day to be able to use this device. And also, if you did have a chance to access it, it typically went to the male child, not the girl child. So again, sort of this inequity for gender. And so then at that point, we realized we weren't going to be as effective and went into this hybrid model where we could meet in small groups of 3 to 5 with the teachers that lived in the community, and then provide, the education to both girls and boys. But all of these little situations have really come up to the surface, even though they were already there, perhaps they weren't as evident.
Right. Yes. And how do you address the psychological needs of your students? I mean, the situation faced by refugees is complex and stressful. How can they cope with an online program under the circumstances?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So when I first started the organization, I traveled to Greece, and I went to many refugee camps myself, and I wanted to talk to the children because I'm not a refugee. I've not lived through war. So who am I to tell them, what I think is best for them? And it was really shocking because as I was talking to, so many children, they all kept saying the same thing. They all wanted to feel safe. And they said this in so many languages, in so many ways, but it kept going back to the same idea of safety. And ironically, I had taken safety for granted. I live in a peaceful place. I don't walk out in the street and I'm scared for my safety. So it was really eye-opening for myself even. And so then if you think of this idea of safety and you look back to the pyramid of psychosocial support, as well as even Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need to start with this basis of feeling safe and making sure that, your needs are being met, because you can't meet the other ones without that. So we really kind of first create a safe space where children can, feel like they can express themselves, they can process, they can, et cetera. I mean, so many different things. And this is very difficult to do online because, we're not there. And so we rely heavily on our teachers. The nice part about this sort of prototype that we launched in Bangladesh is that since the children were already part of these classrooms, they already had a somewhat of a trust with the teachers, but you need to build that trust first to help anyone heal. And that's not something that happens overnight. That's something that takes time. And it's not something that, I always worry, never unwrap something that you can't put back together. So we do things very, very slowly. We never want to, unravel any trauma that could do more harm, because that's not our intention. That's not what we're trying to do. So in terms of online, we've taken back a little bit of a step back. And what we've done is introduced it in very gradual stages. Mm-hmm. So for instance, in the first episode, we're helping children identify their emotions. Very simple, just what are you feeling? What's your emotional temperature? If you had this temperature thermometer, where are you at? Because if you can identify what you're feeling, then the next step is, okay, how can I manage that? And so it's kind of we've introduced it in baby steps online, if that makes any sense. I hope. But yeah, it's not as effective as in person, that's for sure.
Yeah. I'll pose you one last question, and then I have a list of people waiting to ask you questions, and I'll open that. My final question to you is, in the past 2 years, past 3 years of your existence, Amal Alliance, so who have been your best partners, and is it governments, civil society actors, or the private sector? And what do you hope, people like us can do to help the work of your foundation?
Yes, thank you. So up until now, it's been civil society actors. In fact, our model is heavily relying on them because we work with local NGOs to make sure it's sustainable. However, if we want to grow and be able to reach more children, we really need the support of government, and we need a multi-sectoral approach where governments come into play. But unfortunately, the way the humanitarian sector is structured, it's really not open for new players on the block. It's usually the typical institutions, the typical players. In fact, I'll share an anecdote. In one of my very first meetings, I was so excited to be attending a Global Compact meeting. I had a very senior level diplomat actually call me an aunt. And she said, no, but you're a little ant, and this is the UN. What does the UN want with a little ant? I mean, obviously I wanted to run home and cry. But that made me realize that, okay, yes, I might have been a little ant, but I was a little ant that had a seat at the table. And that little ant was going to voice and bring agency to people that didn't have a seat at the table and couldn't express, things that were happening and shed light on that. So I think here, where your help would be invaluable is, so many countries are experiencing displaced children, children out of school. I mean, now the pandemic has, moving beyond just refugees. I mean, there's so many children that may not go back to school at the end of this. And I think all of us could use a little bit of support to ease that transition back into the classroom. So, we might be the one-stop shop, but we can help with other partners if we bring in the private sector, governments, to try to figure out what ways we can advance that to make these certain that these kids don't lose a year of their life, essentially, of their education in optimal development time.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for that reply. And I believe a little ant can make a big difference.
Thank you.
You have just shown that you can do that. So let me now open up the floor to question from participants. So I think most of you have done this so many times, you know the drill. When I call on you, unmute yourself, identify yourself, ask the question, and mute yourself again so that everyone can hear Danielle's response. So I will call on Amabel James. She had put up her hand first. So please go ahead. You need to unmute. Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Now it is. Just from working here in New York on various voluntary things, it's very hard for these different groups to coordinate each other. And you're working across international lines. How do you enable everyone to do their best work? It's the collaboration that I worry about. I see competitiveness instead of collaboration.
That's a fantastic question, Amabel. Thank you for bringing that up. So that's actually one of the reasons I first started the organization, because I used to donate a lot of my personal money just to different causes, and I was shocked at how little organizations collaborate, how they build on each other's strengths. And it just made no sense because in that same trip that I was in Greece, I was mistaken as an investor and I didn't correct the organization. I was like, sure, tell me about your financials. and so, I mean, I was disgusted with how many organizations were involved taking a cut. And then at the end of the day, there were 30 kids in class, and it should be costing maybe, I don't know, $2,000 a month to, educate these 30 kids. And they're like, oh, we're getting 20,000 euros. I'm like, why is this money just going to waste? So because of that, I started the organization, not knowing that it was such a competitive environment, or at least I thought maybe we can get people to collaborate. But I'm a very persistent person. So when, one person would say no, or the next one would say no, I would just keep kind of going. And I think what I learned, it took me about 2 years to basically get people to really collaborate. But I learned if it's a win-win for everyone, there is no reason for people not to collaborate. But you just need to find that common ground. So for instance, our local NGOs, the reason most of them don't collaborate with big NGOs is because they can't afford fancy curriculum or, you know, trainings that cost $30,000. So I said, hey, we're going to give you the training and we're going to give you the curriculum for free. I just need you to let me use your building and, you know, let us tap into your teachers so we can train them. So they were like, fantastic. That in turn led to, you know, different things, because then, okay, well, how do you operate in one country when you're registered in another? But there's this NGO umbrella. So then you have to kind of let the government know, hey, we're doing this. We want to make sure we're in your borders. We don't want to piss you off. We want to make sure that we're doing everything according to the book. And so there are a lot of loopholes in the humanitarian, you know, sector, but it's knowing how to connect the dots. And there's not a lot of organizations that want to connect the dots. But if you can connect them, it's a win-win for everyone. I mean, it makes no sense if, you know, if I was a government and I have, I don't know, millions of kids in my border inside my country and they're being uneducated. I mean, it's a security risk. What's going to happen when they grow up? Why wouldn't I want to do something to solve the problem? But obviously they might not have the money, or they have other priorities, there's pressing issues. So if someone presents a solution to them that says, hey, I can help you with doing this, you know, but we need to get, you know, the private sector or this corporation or whatever involved, there is a way to do it. It just needs to be framed in a way that pushes everyone's agenda forward.
Thanks so much. No, that was a terrific answer.
And that's a terrific question too. And I think, Danielle, I think the key is also the fact that you provide a template of a curriculum.
Yeah. You know, I'll give a good example in Bangladesh. So in the Rohingya camps, you can't educate the Rohingya children in certain languages. You know, there's all these laws. So technically, we wouldn't be able to work there, but we provide child protection. So we're operating under child protection. We're not, and so there's these ways of working, and you know, there's a very hard permit to get to be able to work in the camps, and we got it like this. And the reason I think we got it like that is because we looked very carefully at what all the laws were and said, we're not going to disrespect any of your laws. On the contrary, we're going to provide something that's going to help not only the Rohingyas, but also, you know, 75% of our program is helping Bangladeshi children. And so there was really no reason to say no.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a good model to work not just with the displaced children from elsewhere, but also within the country.
Exactly.
Right. So next we have Kim Dorman, who would like to ask a question. So Kim, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I was just running downstairs. I was just wondering, your social emotional intelligence work reminds me a lot of the work that Mark Brackett's doing at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And I was wondering if you were somehow affiliated with him.
So I don't know him, but I'm a huge fan. So we're both part of Karenga, which is this social emotional learning sort of, I'm probably going to butcher what it is. It's like a network around the world. And he's phenomenal. I've read his book. I've heard him speak. I think he's amazing. His ruler approach, I think, is more applied to schools. And he's probably a little bit more ahead of us than ahead of our organization. But we usually work also in community centers, so in the informal education system. And so I believe his system works specifically with the formal education system. So we also tap into the informal because, as many of you know, the formal education system is one, but in a lot of these locations where that just doesn't exist, there aren't any schools, you need to have sort of an informal structure as well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. Betty?
Hi, Betty Robbins from Women for Women. I'm going to segue off of a question that you were answering 1 or 2 questions ago, but Danielle, as you move from country to country, how do you address the language and the cultural issues that play such a major role in education and education reform? And is there an assumption that you communicate with people in certain languages? And if so, what are they?
That is a phenomenal question. And I was actually just in a think tank on Monday discussing this. So, you know, language is really important because you can translate anything you want, but when you're talking about social emotional concepts, they don't translate very well. I mean, you know, the word empathy doesn't really exist in a lot of languages. So, you know, you can have a literal translation, but that's not going to help anyone. So you need to make sure that language is really adapted. And so that we work with translators that are very, very, I guess I want to say like beyond just, you know, the regular translators, like experts in their field that know how to contextualize it and localize it. And we also work with refugee translators. There's a phenomenal organization called Natakalam. And so they're refugee women and they hire these women to translate. So the language in itself is not only just, you know, it comes from the same dialect, et cetera. So that's how we sort of make the programs translate to a really, really, you know, proper translation. In terms of working with the organizations and with the governments, that's different. So I speak 3 languages, but that's not necessarily the ones of the places that we work in. But, you know, in my previous incarnation, I used to work for the US government. I always worked with a lot of countries that perhaps I didn't know their languages. But I've always been extremely respectful of cultural norms and all these different cultural nuances. And I think when we approach any meeting or any situation, we know all of that ahead of time and we're respectful. And, you know, that can be more important than the language in itself. So having that understanding and that background and knowing who you're speaking to is really, really key because, you know, at the end of the day, if you're going to be working somewhere else, you need to be very, very respectful of that country because you're not going to come in and impose whatever you think is best, you know, for them. So we haven't had any issues yet. I don't know if that's just my personality. I don't know, but you know, I get asked that often, and I've never had an issue ever, you know. but
Yeah, I think it's a very good answer and a very good question. Maybe some background. Danielle is multicultural.
Yes. Yeah, I'm half Mexican, half Persian. I grew up in San Diego. I lived in Switzerland. I've lived in Scotland. Yeah, I'm not exactly your typical person. So
Yeah, so you're able to relate to people of different cultures and aware of cultural sensitivities. And I think that helps when you work with authorities, people as well as refugees and children in different countries of different cultural background.
yeah, and I mean, just a note on my personal life, my family is huge on traveling. So I've traveled to about, I think it's like 72 countries I was trying to name. And so usually I've been to the country at least of whoever I'm talking with. So that's a really nice icebreaker as well. So.
Yeah, thank you. So we have Tina next. Please go ahead, Tina.
Thank you, Zarina. Thank you, Danielle. You're just amazing. You're a mini United Nations, much like we all are that you're seeing today. And I suppose that does help to facilitate culturally, I imagine, as a lot of your stumbling blocks would be around that. My question is more, I'd say specific. I am an educator as well, so I'm always social emotional learning encompasses all the developments, all of psychology, all of cognitive, language, physical. How do you train your teachers, your staff? And do you get any kind of assistance with that from the host country? Or are these trained here? Are they already in the refugees camps? Are they parents, of course, are the first teachers? How do you take that mini microcosm of the refugee camp along with the greater macrocosm of the environment and produce curricula and teachers and supports for these children?
That's a great question. And so I'm going to preface that with I'm not an educator. And because I know what my weaknesses are, when we first designed the curriculum, I reached out to organizations that I admired their work, whether it be in schools in New York or in California, and said, hey, you do, dance really well, or you do art therapy really well, or you do this really well, but why don't we bring it all together and combine all of our strengths? And so the curriculum was really born by the rainbow of a basis of about 7 different curriculums that were tested in various different scenarios, designed by educators, lots of contributions by a lot of consultants that were, either teachers or various other, fields. And so the curriculum in itself is quite strong. So you can basically teach it if you know how to read. However, if you don't know what the difference between compassion or empathy is, well, as a human, you're not going to be able to teach that. And so the training always happens in country. Usually the participants are picked by the local NGO because they're more familiar with who are the community leaders. So it'll be around 20 to 30 women. We've had 1 or 2 men, which is great, but usually it's women. And so it'll be a mixture of about half are teachers, and then half are, women from the refugee population that might have a background in medicine or law, or maybe none at all, maybe no experience whatsoever. And then there also will be the staff of the local NGO. And so the way we do the trainings is I've done the trainings myself, and we bring a team of 3 people. Usually there will be 1 person with an education background, and always someone that's from the local community that speaks the language as well. We don't usually get support from the local government in the trainings. That's usually just us directly with the local NGOs. They'll provide us the space, and we'll coordinate all of that, but that's just sort of how it's been up until now. But what I was going to say about the training, but the way the training is designed is for the facilitator, the teacher, quote unquote, they're going to immerse into the curriculum. So they're going to go through that process, when they were 3 and when they're 5, and because they really need to understand the content. So if they can, things will pop up, if we're doing some sort of a breathing exercise and they're struggling with something in their life, someone's going to suddenly break down in tears. And so, a lot of things just sort of pop up in the 2-week training. And that doesn't mean that everyone in the training is going to teach. So usually we expect about half of them are going to end up teaching, and about half are going to either move on or it's not going to work out. But we train at a larger rate just because we're only there a certain time. But once those sort of issues come up, we know who is going to be a little bit more comfortable delivering the content. And then we do bring in the kids at the later part of the training, and we kind of just sit back and watch them teach. And then we can kind of give them pointers, and somehow it works out towards the course of the training. And you see sort of them grow as individuals too.
Thank you, Danielle, for that response, and thank you, Tina, for the question. We have next Arlene Ray from Canada.
Hi,
Arlene,
can you hear me? Am I on?
Very well.
Okay. Hi, this is really interesting. I remember, Danielle, when I was in Cox's Bazar, there was a feeling that by the host country, by Bangladesh, that they were displaced persons, not refugees. In other words, it's anytime quite soon they might return to Myanmar, which was not to be, but that seemed to be the rationale for not having a sustained education program. And so I'm wondering if, and as you say, these things are slow and have to be unfolded gradually. Is there, first of all, is this a problem in other countries as well? And do you have 2 tracks, if you will, one for displaced children and another for refugees who are there in the longer term? And maybe a supplement question, if it's okay, how does this morph into higher education, skills training, and so on as they get older?
Yeah. Fantastic question. So let me see if I can address all of them. If I forget one, please remind me. So Cox's Bazar, sort of still the same situation of when you visited. There is that notion that they're going to go back, and that's why things aren't as permanent. But the thing with whether you're a refugee or, displaced person, it's really just a legal status. At the end of the day, we do know that most migrants might move on. And so the program was designed to be really flexible. So, I mean, the rainbow is 6 months, but it's not like, oh, if you don't, if you only do 5 months in 1 week, that's it, because we know people are going to move on. And that's also what we expect with some of the teachers even. So the way it's best works is actually when it complements something else. So a really nice happy accident in Lebanon. So we were working inside of a UNICEF building. We didn't have any connection with UNICEF really. We were just using their space. And one of our teachers happened to be one of the teachers from the Basic Literacy and Numeracy program that had a really, really big retention problem. But the kids really liked our program. So the teacher just kind of merged them and told us, and I was like, wait, you can't go hijacking a UNICEF program. Like we have to tell them. so we talked to UNICEF and said, hey, listen, we have this teacher, she's gone rogue, but it seems you have a problem and this might work. So what ended up happening right before COVID is they merged the two for 2 test cycles. And so the idea of this basic literacy and numeracy program was that if the children could pass, they would test into the formal education system. So if the kids weren't going to the program, well, of course, they're not going to test into this system because they're not attending. So our program would help the kids stay and attend and then get those literacy skills that UNICEF was doing way better than we could ever do. And then they had a much higher placement into the formal school system. So when that happened, that was sort of an eye-opening moment for me. I'm like, wait a second, this is like a relay race. We need to team up with the right partners where we pass the baton. So, if we know that we can help in this way, then we pass the baton, whether it be to like a Ministry of Education or a UNICEF, and then they pass the baton to, an academic institution for higher education or vocational training, or even corporations like the Google certificate that just came up where it replaces, higher education, but it, gets them on track to a job. So I've always now seen it as this relay race. It's finding the partners to pass the baton to that's the challenge.
Okay.
Did I answer all your questions?
Yeah, and more.
Oh, okay.
I think she had another part to the question about higher education.
Yeah, but she sort of said that it passes it on so
Yeah.
that they can go into these higher programs if they get the assistance and the placement. So that helps. The teamwork is really impressive.
Well, and the thing is that, a lot of larger organizations do everything, but they lose their core competency. Like I know that we do early childhood and primary really well. We could do secondary. We'd probably be good at it. Whether we would do it really well, I don't know. We probably would definitely not do higher education well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think knowing that and finding the players that, maybe there's someone that does secondary fantastic, and then somebody that does higher education, then you line them up. And it's back to that connecting the dots. So if you were able to connect all these dots and then present it to like a Ministry of Education and say, hey, we have a plan, let's try it. If it doesn't work, at least we tried. I think, why not?
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Arlene, and thank you, Danielle. So following up a little from Arlene's question, where she talked about, the needs of different age category of students moving from early education to higher education. Have you or the Amal Alliance thought about access to job opportunities for refugees? Giving them access to education is one thing. How do you help them reach their aspirations?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what I was just saying about the relay race. So one thing that I recently learned during COVID in UN boot camp actually was that a lot of the girls especially drop out in secondary. And then that brings issues to so many other things of, child marriage, and then, or, even the boys, they start working. But the reason a lot of them drop out is because maybe there isn't a program nearby, or, there's this learning barrier that no one's addressing. And so I think the fact that there's these transition issues that are missing is another key piece of the puzzle. So if we can get a way to sustain the children to go from primary to secondary, well then, that already puts them on a much faster track to employability, whether it be vocational training or higher education. But if you have a huge chunk of them just dropping out, well, then again, it goes back to we have a bigger systemic issue. And so I do think it's finding all of those partners. I think that now that we kind of know who does what, we've been able to see that. I know that the World Bank is doing some wonderful initiatives with vocational training in Uganda, for instance, and making sure that it's not just your typical vocational training, it's making sure that they can, be sustainable and, have livelihood. And so it's back to that piece. Okay, like how do we get them into school? And then who do we link up to send them to the next portion? Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want people that can contribute to society.
Thank you, Danielle. I think we have time for one last question, if it's okay, Danielle, with you.
Yeah.
We have Nia Shiap, who has indicated that she would like to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Zarina. Hi, my name is Nia Shihab from Indonesia. This is a very fantastic, Daniel. And then I have a question that, okay, I'm sure that you have a very good program and also a curriculum, but I just wondering, how do you evaluate the curriculum adoption in the camp with the children, with the teachers, and then how do you identify the success rate of each program? Thank you.
That's a phenomenal question. So when we started, we designed a very rigorous sort of monitoring and evaluation system to go along with the curriculum. Big mistake though, because we designed it here in the West based on social emotional sort of learning metrics here, and they don't apply to education in emergencies. They just don't. They don't translate well. So we went back to the drawing board and said, okay, what can we do? Because if we were doing 360 assessments. So we were getting feedback from the teachers, feedback from the NGOs, and then feedback from the children. But most of the children were illiterate, so they wouldn't even be able to fill out the pre and post questionnaires. So in that case, we created an emoji-based survey, which was much, much more effective than round one. Except we had the problem that, kids were, circling each other's like, oh, you put a happy face. Okay, so am I. So it wasn't 100% effective. And that's when I learned how important the evidence-based research was for funding. So, which I totally understand. I get it. But at the end of the day, you're dealing with humans, not numbers. And so some of these things that they're measuring, like how do you measure someone's, change in mood over the course of, it doesn't come down to a quantifiable number. So we went back to the drawing board, worked with other organizations, and when that happened, COVID hit. So part of this prototype, UNHCR wants to build a really solid evidence-based for social emotional learning, because that's the one major hindrance our program has. We've not been able to get a proper evidence-based research because it's really expensive and, we didn't have the funding for that. So we've been working with NYU Global Ties to design the M&E sort of addition to what's going to be happening in Bangladesh. And so we're really hopeful that based on the metrics that we'll be able to get from this prototype, we will be able to create at least a at distance, M&E plan. And this is all based on the tools that were assessed by Harvard INEE last year as part of the social emotional learning sort of mechanisms for evaluation in the field. So hopefully we'll finally have our evidence-based by December. But I do want to remind, and one thing that really just personally bothers me about the whole evidence-based thing is we are dealing with people. And so, if we think back and we're hearing all these fantastic stories from teachers in the community, that does count for something. So it might not be, data collected from a phone that turns into a lovely little percentage. And I think that gets lost from what happens in the field to how it's being funded.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Nia, for the question. Now it just leaves me to thank Danielle on behalf of the WIF board and the WIF members. Today we had 62 participants. That's a big number. And you really gave us a lot of hope that even a little ant can make a big difference in just 3 short years with just what started out as a dream, starting small, and you really made an impact on the lives of children and future generations. So thank you very much, and we wish you lots of success with Amal Alliance, and may many more Amal Alliance sprout up. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. It's been an honor. I hope to meet you all in person at some time, and I am so grateful for this opportunity. I'll drop my email in the chat in case anybody wants to connect.
Yes, please. And also Amal Alliance has a fantastic website and an Instagram account and Facebook, so you know how to connect to Danielle and Amal Alliance if you wish to pursue contributing to Amal Alliance in some form or other. Before we leave, I want to thank everyone for your enthusiastic participation. Thank you. And please mark your calendars for our next event in November. That will be on November 4th. At 11 a.m. we have Professor Peter Piot joining us again, but this time he's in London. And thanks to COVID and Zoom, we are able to speak to him even though he's not in New York City. So please mark your calendars for November the 4th. And thank you once again, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, lovely.